One, if you guys don't seal up your border in the north and seal up your border in the south, Mexico and Canada, 25% tariffs. And China, if you don't clean up the fentanyl situation, 10% on anything coming into our country. We got tens of thousands coming in. It's a lot less of a problem than the south, but there's a huge problem because you're not putting any assets there. The other issues is the drugs that come through to the governor of New Hampshire.
The president-elect told the prime minister if Canada cannot fix the border issues and trade deficit, he will levy a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods on day one when he returns.
In a high-stakes political showdown at Mar-a-Lago, the stakes for Canada's economy were never higher. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau unexpectedly met with President-elect Donald Trump, the atmosphere was thick with tension. With a stark message from the American leader, Trudeau was faced with a choice that could devastate Canada's economy. Trump was unwavering in his demands, declaring that if Canada couldn't fix its trade deficit and control its borders, a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods would be imposed from day one upon his return to office. Trudeau, visibly shaken, tried to argue that such tariffs would crush the Canadian economy, but Trump wasn't having it. The conversation quickly turned to the issue of border security, particularly Canada's failure to tackle the fentanyl crisis and illegal immigration. As Trump continued to escalate the situation, he joked about Canada becoming the 51st state, which caused nervous laughter around the table. Yet, the weight of his words lingered. Canada's future was on the line, and the threat of economic ruin loomed large. The dinner at Mar-a-Lago wasn't just a routine diplomatic visit. It was a desperate plea from Trudeau to avoid an economic disaster. But despite Trudeau's attempts to deflect the tariffs, the pressure was on. Trump was clear: if Canada didn't shape up, the consequences would be severe. The potential for a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods could cause economic turmoil, leading to job losses, supply chain disruptions, and widespread instability on both sides of the border. Behind the scenes, Canadian officials worked frantically to figure out how to appease Trump's demands while protecting the country's economic interests. Trudeau's gamble to meet with Trump face-to-face might have bought him some time, but the clock was ticking. The Canadian Prime Minister tried to shift the narrative by arguing that imposing such tariffs would hurt American businesses and workers as well, but Trump's resolve was unshaken. Trudeau's team knew the importance of this high-stakes negotiation, and the dinner had been their best shot at avoiding an economic disaster. But with Trump's explosive tariff threat hanging in the balance, it was clear that the relationship between the two nations had reached a tipping point. Canada's future depended on whether Trudeau could find a way to resolve the crisis without giving in to Trump's demands. The global community now watches closely as both nations are teetering on the brink of a trade war. The next few weeks will determine whether Canada can avoid a devastating economic collapse or if Trump will follow through with his tariffs, sending shockwaves through both economies. For now, the battle for economic survival continues, and millions of Canadian jobs are at risk. As the news of the dinner and the explosive conversation spread, the pressure on Trudeau mounted. Canadian citizens, businesses, and political leaders alike anxiously awaited the next steps. The threat of the 25% tariffs was no longer just an empty promise. It had become a tangible force that could change the landscape of Canada's economy. The question on everyone's mind: could Trudeau navigate this political minefield, or was Canada heading straight into an economic catastrophe? Behind closed doors, the Canadian government scrambled to find a solution that could stave off disaster. Officials were desperate to find a compromise that would placate Trump's demands without causing irreparable damage to Canada's industries and jobs. The looming tariff threat wasn't just a bargaining chip, it was a weapon that Trump had made clear he was ready to wield. Trump's unyielding stance only seemed to intensify as the days wore on. His administration had made it clear that tariffs were not just an option, they were a tool to balance the federal budget and push through trade reforms. In Trump's eyes, Canada's failure to address border security and drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl, was a serious issue that couldn't be ignored. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the world watched as this economic showdown played out. Meanwhile, Trudeau's public statements remained measured, but privately, the pressure on him was mounting. He knew that every word he spoke, every move he made, could either strengthen or weaken Canada's position. The idea of negotiating with Trump was already a daunting task, but with millions of Canadian jobs and the stability of the nation's economy on the line, the stakes had never been so high. As the weeks passed, the question of whether Canada could survive the economic storm became even more pressing. The Canadian government had no choice but to continue negotiating with the Trump administration, trying to strike a deal that would prevent the worst-case scenario. However, with Trump's hardened stance and his administration's focus on tariffs as a means to push through policy changes, there was little room for compromise. The Canadian public, already dealing with the fallout of past trade tensions, found themselves wondering how their lives would change if Trump followed through on his threat. Would the everyday worker be affected? Would businesses be able to withstand the economic hit? And perhaps most concerning of all, how would this trade war shape the future of U.S.-Canada relations for years to come? On the other hand, Trump's approach to dealing with foreign trade was becoming increasingly evident. His administration had made it clear that no nation would be immune from tariffs if they didn't meet certain standards, especially concerning issues like border security and illegal immigration. The message was loud and clear. No one was safe, and Canada was no exception. With each passing day, the urgency of the situation grew. While Trudeau and his team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the rest of Canada waited with bated breath. The outcome of this negotiation would not only determine the fate of millions of jobs and industries across Canada, but would also shape the future of the country's relationship with its powerful southern neighbor. As Trump and Trudeau continued to play their high-stakes game of diplomacy, one thing was certain. No matter how the situation unfolded, it was clear that the impact of this trade dispute would be felt for years to come. Whether Canada would be able to protect its interests and avoid the economic disaster that Trump's tariffs could bring was still up in the air, but the fight for survival was just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between the two leaders only seemed to intensify. The possibility of a 25% tariff on Canadian goods was hanging over the nation like a dark cloud. Canadian businesses, particularly those in industries heavily reliant on trade with the U.S., began preparing for the worst. They knew that a trade war could cripple their operations, leading to massive layoffs and widespread economic instability. While the Trudeau government worked around the clock to negotiate with the Trump administration, the public debate grew louder. Economists and trade experts weighed in, predicting the severe consequences of such tariffs. From agricultural exports to automotive manufacturing, no sector was safe from the potential fallout. Trudeau's government faced immense pressure from every corner, trying to balance the demands of the U.S. while safeguarding Canada's economic future. On the international stage, the stakes were just as high. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship had always been one of the world's most important economic partnerships, and any disruption could have ripple effects globally. Other nations, watching closely, wondered how this showdown would impact their own trade relations with both Canada and the U.S. Would this lead to a domino effect of protectionist policies around the world? Or would it simply escalate into a full-scale trade war, reshaping the global economy? Meanwhile, Trump seemed more determined than ever to see his policies through. Despite criticism from various quarters, including those in his own party, he remained unwavering in his belief that tariffs were necessary to fix what he saw as a broken system. Trump argued that it wasn't just about punishing Canada, it was about putting American interests first and securing the safety of the U.S. population by addressing issues like illegal immigration and drug trafficking. Trudeau, however, refused to back down completely. While he knew the political and economic stakes, he was also determined to protect Canada's sovereignty and economic integrity. His team continued to explore every avenue, seeking exemptions and special deals to minimize the impact of Trump's tariffs. But time was running out, and the clock was ticking on a potential resolution. The Canadian people, watching the drama unfold, were caught in a state of anxiety. Many wondered how their lives would change if the tariffs were imposed. Would food prices rise? Would manufacturing jobs disappear? The uncertainty was unbearable, as families and workers in every province braced themselves for a potential economic downturn. With no clear answer on the horizon, the mood across the country was tense. Then, in a last-ditch effort to avoid catastrophe, Trudeau and his advisers proposed an alternative. In a bold move, they suggested the creation of a joint U.S.-Canada task force to address border security, drug trafficking, and immigration issues together. The idea was to offer a more cooperative approach, focusing on shared solutions to the problems that had triggered Trump's tariff threat in the first place. It was a gamble, but one that Trudeau hoped would prove to Trump that Canada was serious about fixing the issues at hand while protecting its own interests. As the proposal was put forward, there was a flicker of hope. Could this be the breakthrough that would prevent a full-blown trade war? Or would Trump's hardline stance continue to prevail, leading to the disastrous tariffs that could cripple both nations? The next few days would be critical, as the two leaders tried to hammer out an agreement that could preserve their fragile relationship while avoiding the economic chaos that loomed on the horizon. For now, all eyes were on the ongoing negotiations. The future of U.S.-Canada relations, the economic livelihoods of millions, and the stability of the North American continent hung in the balance. Would diplomacy triumph over the threat of tariffs, or would the two nations fall into an unprecedented trade war? Only time would tell, but the stakes couldn't have been higher.